Good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Katerji Show with me, your host, Katerji. And joining us tonight for another Ukraine episode, dealing specifically with Ukraine's Foreign Legion, Colin Freeman, war correspondent, veteran war correspondent, has written a new book. But we're also going to dive into some of the stuff that's been happening in Ukraine. This whole thing happening with Poland. So without further ado, my guest, Colin Freeman.
Hello, good evening.
Hello, Colin. Let me just make sure, because we're using Zoom tonight because Streamlabs is melting down. Can you hear Colin okay, is my question. There's a little bit of a delay, so we need to wait for the audience to reply. Colin, can you just tell us about your day? How was your day?
My day was fine. I note that you and several other people now refer to me as a veteran foreign correspondent, which I think is purely based on a thing about age rather than experience. I've suddenly noticed that. It's a reminder that one is no longer young anymore, sadly.
That's perfect. It seems like we don't have an echo at the moment, so that's good to know. Good. We are echoless, right? Okay. Well, welcome to the show, Colin. To make you feel slightly better, I do call myself a veteran as well at this point, but I don't know if that's going to make you feel much better because I'm not that young anymore. So, look, what is it they say about war journalists? The ones that are most likely to get, to fall are the ones at the start of their career or the ones right at the end of their career. The ones right at the start because they're inexperienced, and the ones right at the end because they think they're bulletproof. So, I hope I never reach that bulletproof stage of being a veteran war journalist.
Oh, yes. I've heard people say, my general rule is never be the last in, but think carefully about being the first in as well. I'm not the most adventurous in of people in this particular field. Although war is only really a bit of the job. I mean, most of the time, most jobs I've been on in my life, it's more just foreign correspondence. So you're doing all sorts of other stories as well. I'd say about 5% of the job involves war of some sort. But I mean, obviously in Ukraine for the last 3 years, that's been very much the focus. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I suppose it's a bit of both, really. War is a mixture of politics and all kinds of defense, military, all of these things come into it, really. So it's more a sort of marketing because it just sounds more interesting, really, doesn't it? So
yes, more interesting than saying you're an agricultural correspondent.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to define what a foreign correspondent is as well, because what is foreign modifying? Are you a foreigner corresponding, or anyway. But look, we're here to talk about the conflict. So look, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? That's the first question I normally ask. Tell us about your background.
Yeah, well, sure. I am, as I say, as I just said, a foreign correspondent and now probably a veteran. I've been covering international affairs for 20 years or so, mainly for the Daily Telegraph, but also for a few other newspapers. I started my career on local newspapers in the UK, then was on the London Evening Standard for several years in the late 1990s. That's how old I am. Then when the war in Iraq came along, that was my first experience of going overseas to cover an international conflict. It was largely by accident, actually. I'd never intended to become a foreign correspondent, but when I was on the Evening Standard, I was not one of the star reporters. I was never going to get sent to cover any big international stories. And at the time when the Iraq War seemed in the offing, because it was one of these unusual wars where the invasion was, it was pretty clear it was going to go ahead for several months in advance of it actually happening. And the Evening Standard actually had a team of people that they were planning to send. And it was very clear that I was not going to be on the team or even on the subs bench in any way. And that while this, pivotal event in history the first really big story of my generation, I think you could say. I was in my early 30s at the time. While this was going to be unfolding, I would be back in London writing about roadworks on the A23 or tube delays or other kind of stuff like that. And eventually, I think I just whinged about it so much to other people that eventually, to shut me up, some photographer that I worked with said, well, why don't you just go to the war and freelance instead? And I was like, "What, can you do that?" And he said, "Well, why not?" And so that was like a light bulb going off in my head. I was young, free, and single in those days. Didn't really have any attachments, and I thought it would be a bit like sort of backpacking with a difference. Slightly more adventurous version of backpacking. It seemed like a great idea. Other people sort of said, no, that's a dreadful idea. You don't speak Arabic. You've never been to Iraq. You probably can't even pinpoint Iraq on the map. You have no contacts out there. You have no insurance. You don't know what you're doing, etc.
All of that good advice. That's good advice.
Yes, all of which were fair points. Yeah. But I did eventually go. I got there on the day the war ended. After 3 weeks, the day the invasion officially ended, which is not a great thing, feather in your cap to have as a war correspondent. But it was actually a good time to be there because the other staff people were beginning to pull out at that time. All the big fighting was over. But as we now know, it was the invasion went like clockwork, but it was the occupation afterwards that was a disaster, and which unravelled spectacularly. So I was there for a couple of years. Then to sort of move on quickly, I was given a job as chief foreign correspondent, on the Daily Telegraph, who I'd worked as a stringer for while I was in Baghdad. And then, I was there for about 10 years, then left the Daily Telegraph to go freelance in 2016, which is a posh way of saying I got made redundant. And I've been freelancing ever since 2016, really. I still work a lot for the Telegraph because as a freelancer, it's easier to work for people you've worked for before. They know you, you know them. And so it was that at the start of the Ukraine invasion, the Telegraph foreign desk needed all hands to the pump and a few extra hired hands as well, of which I was one. I was sent to Lviv on, I think, the very last flight into Lviv on the evening of Wednesday, the 23rd of February. The war started on the 24th. Mainly as a kind of backstop guy in case anything happened in Lviv. This being the point at which, of course, nobody thought anything much was going to happen at all. It was going to be a big diplomatic climb down by Putin.
I thought that it was going to happen, so I will maintain that I was convinced it was going to happen. So.
I certainly did not. I got into Lviv. I went to checked in at the hotel, had a couple of beers, and I was due to sort of be there for a couple of weeks basically and take over from a correspondent that we already had in Kiev who had been there for about a month and who was tired and wanted to pull out. So I thought it was going to be a very quiet ride, and then woke up the next morning and, we know what greeted everybody the next morning. Yeah.
The rest is history. Well, look, what some of your experience there really tallies with mine in particular. Like, I didn't come from a place of financial wealth or whatever. So really, making a career for myself has been a real struggle over those years. There's kind of two routes into it. There's work at a company and build your way up. And, I never really seem to be able to build my way. I've spent loads of time on a desk in London and producing in London, but never, was even in consideration to be deployed. I think it's more because of my big mouth rather than my lack of talent. I am quite a opinionated individual, and I rub authority up the wrong way often, which is why I have great relationships with editors who technically aren't like my senior, but as soon as there's kind of like someone above me, I can tend to make decisions for myself. But the point being that really my career was never going to get off, to get going to the trajectory that it has without making that decision for myself to go out and freelance. Because at that point you're there, you are, people will judge you by the quality of your work, and
And the
that's.
fact that you're there, yeah, as, in the place where they're of interest, definitely, yeah.
Well, I mean, what happened with Ukraine when the war started is that a lot of people weren't here, and a lot of people, you probably know this quite well. There were lots of journalists that left Kiev on the 24th. They didn't hang around for like 2-3 days. There weren't that many freelance journalists in Kiev at all. There weren't even that many, senior correspondents here. So it basically meant that if you wanted to speak to someone on the ground, you had like a list this long of English language journalists that you could contact. So I did benefit from that by making the decision to do that. But look, this is a career like any else, and you have to take risks to be able to do it, and that was one. And going to Iraq, as you said, you might have missed the invasion, but you were there at the start of the civil war, basically, which was a much longer period. And one of the frustrating things about talking about the Middle East is, as you probably know, having covered it for so long, that the Iraq War, as you said, was a very successful war. If we're talking about the process of the invasion to the toppling of the Ba'athist regime, it's always the period after that, the post-conflict period, that's hard to get right. And we've had various different examples. I think there's a famous quote, it escapes me who said it, but we invaded Iraq and it was a disaster. We didn't invade Libya and it was a disaster. I mean, we didn't invade Syria and it was a disaster. And we intervened in Libya but didn't have boots on the ground and it was a disaster. Like basically whichever version of foreign involvement this is an American diplomat, I think, said it. Trying to describe, American policy towards the Middle East, and it's sort of frustrating having these conversations in the United Kingdom, because particularly with that kind of thing, it's sort of a do no harm foreign policy approach is favoured by people who aren't particularly knowledgeable about the Middle East. But if you leave a vacuum of influence projection in the Middle East, other people will fill that vacuum, and every action has a reaction. So not doing anything is just as much of a conscious decision to do something as doing something, which is difficult to explain. Anyway, but we're back to Ukraine. I wanted to pick your brains on what's been happening in the last 24, 48 hours, what you make of it, and what you make of the European response to it, more importantly, I guess.
I should confess that I've spent the last couple of days. You asked me how I've been spending today. Yesterday and much of today, I was at the British government's big arms fair in London. So I have not been covering the ins and outs of these drone incursions into Poland and in sort of in minute detail. But my thoughts on it really would be that I remember that we had sort of more minor versions of these incursions a couple of years ago, and I think we've had several of them. My sense generally is that much noise will be made, but little will actually be done, as long as it can be it's reasonably easy to pass it off as an oversight by the Russians, and that there's nobody killed or injured. If one of these Shahed drones had demolished a tower block or something like that and killed dozens of people, I think that might be a different scenario. Having said that, I'm not even sure then that NATO would want to go to war over the deaths of 30 people or even 50 people, even if it happened more than once. And I mean, this is the bit that this is NATO's weak point, is that it doesn't want to be easily provoked, and one just hopes that Putin is not seeking to do this as a sort of as a conscious policy, and that we're not going to see further attacks of this sort. But unless that is what he's doing, and I mean, I think if there is an element, or if it does become clear that there is a pattern to this, then some sort of response will have to be forthcoming. Although whether it's a military response or some really crippling sanctions of some sort, which might actually be more effective and which a lot of people would welcome anyway, That's that's something we'll just have to wait and see. That's about as much intelligent observations as I've got on that thing, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Oh no! Listen, it's great. It's a great insight into what's been happening. You don't need to know the minute details of the back and forth, but really, this looks like Russian probing. They're trying to probe NATO. What they want is NATO Article 5 to be undermined and not hold. And if it doesn't hold, then all bets are off, because why shouldn't Russia invade the Baltic states if there's no one going to stop them? And if I've said this at the start of the conflict. I said if we weren't going to stop the invasion in Ukraine, why would the people who were most against supporting Ukraine, why would they be any less interested or invested in defending Poland or Latvia or Estonia? I don't see it personally. It's just a very easy line to draw and say, well, we'll defend every inch of NATO territory, but Ukraine isn't in NATO, etc., etc. Really, the threat is at the door. The enemy's at the gate, effectively.
Yeah, I think on the other hand, there is a difference between some drones straying into Poland, ostensibly by accident, and having Putin send forces into the Baltics, be they formal Russian soldiers or a repeat of the little green men that we saw in Crimea. My sense is that either of those, if they appeared, would be dealt with in fairly rapid fashion, or there would be a pretty immediate response from the Estonians, the Latvians, and other, the rest of the Baltic people. I don't think they would wait around too much to worry about what NATO was going to say.
These NATO members have agency, and again, a lot of the talk about this sort of denies that agency to them and think that this is an alliance that's led by the nose by the United States, and nothing should disabuse people of that notion more than the way European leaders have been trying to corral Trump like herding cats to try and get him to do anything the way Europeans see security going forward. Look, let's bring it back right to the start of the war. I mean, you and I met in Kyiv, so you didn't stay in Lviv for long. You made it to the capital and you were knocking about with the rest of us. So why don't you tell us about your experience over the course of the war? Tell us the stories that you remember reporting, and then we'll dive into your book, which I can't wait to read.
Well, sure. I mean, I came to Kiev. I got to Kiev on about day 5 of the war. I was in Lviv for about 3 or 4 days. There was a curfew for 2 days, so you couldn't move. And then I was, if you remember at the time, most people were fleeing Kiev. There were enormous queues of traffic. It was impossible to get a hire car or find a driver, virtually impossible to find a driver who would take you from Lviv to Kiev in the opposite direction. I was beginning to despair of getting there. Eventually, though, somebody said, well, why don't you just take the train? I was like, you what? Yeah, the train. And
still running.
The trains were, of course, still running. That had not occurred to me, despite the fact that every so often, every hour or so, there was a train arriving in Lviv bringing refugees from Kiev and elsewhere. It had not occurred to me that those trains had to go back to take more refugees, and they went back empty, and that's what I did. And the train was very well run. It was almost completely empty, apart from an Italian photographer or two and a few very worried-looking Ukrainians. But otherwise, it was very much business as normal. I remember thinking, we have all kinds of problems with trains breaking down and strikes and everything else in the UK, and yet here in the middle of a war, we've got trains still running. I remember the photographer even being told not to put his feet told off for putting his feet on the seat. So standards were being maintained. So I was then in Kiev for about a month during the Russian siege. I did the same things that most people did, which was to go up and watch from a relatively safe distance what was going on in places like Irpin and so on. I remember thinking, as most people did at the beginning, that Kiev would not hold out for more than a few days. Then it was like maybe a couple of weeks. then the next thing you knew, the Russians were departing, and then it was like, well, they'll have a go in the Donbass, and then all things will change. As we know, it never really has. Since then, I think I've made about a dozen trips to Ukraine, mostly on the Telegraph ticket, as in paid for and funded by the Telegraph. Occasionally freelance as well. Usually staying for sort of between 2 weeks and a month. So kind of covered, spent a lot of time down in Mykolaiv and Kherson, quite a bit of time in the Donbass, and a few times up in Kiev. What could I say that was particularly of interest about my own experiences? Comparing it to the Middle East, certainly covering there, it's a very different sort of war. The front lines are relatively fixed, and also Western reporters are welcome, which is a change from some of the other places I've worked in the Middle East and Africa, where foreign reporters are often a target for not for ordinary people, but for kidnappers and
I mean, we are targeted here by the Russians, but the idea that I'm working in a country where the people really want foreign journalists there on the ground and to give them as much access as it's possible to give them. I've never worked in an environment like this before, so it feels very different, right?
It makes a lot of difference. It's not like in Baghdad where you're worrying about every time you leave your hotel whether there's people got spying on you and watching your movements with a view to kidnapping you, and then the next thing you're appearing in a jihadist video with someone pointing a sword at your neck. When I was in Iraq, that sort of thing was happening quite a lot, and it was a much more frightening environment to be in, really. And I think there's something personal about that when you're being hunted because of who you are or what you look like. Obviously, in Ukraine, there is a risks of other sorts, risks from missiles, things like that. But there's something slightly more impersonal about that, I think, which in a certain sense is slightly less psychologically wearing. Having said that, I mean, I've had one close scrape in Ukraine, which was back in 2023, summer 2023. It was the Ria Pizza restaurant bombing, which I'm sure many of your listeners will remember was the bombing, a missile that hit the Ria Pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk in June of 2023, where I think 14 people were killed, more than 60 injured, including two 15-year-old girls and the Ukrainian novelist Victoria Amelina. I might well have been amongst them were it not for a very lucky twist of fate. I was in the restaurant that night at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. I know it was 7 o'clock because I checked the timings afterwards for reasons that will become apparent. At 2 minutes past, we were literally just browsing the menu, trying to attract the waiter's attention, when I got a phone call from someone saying who was a military contact who we'd been trying to get hold of for about a week, and he happened to be passing through Kramatorsk. And he said, "I'm here for the next hour. If you want to come see me, feel free, but you need to get your skates on. You need to move now." So, slightly cursing under my breath because we'd had a long day, we cancelled dinner and we packed up. We got up and just went straight off to see him. And then we were on the other side of town doing this interview with him at exactly, I think it was 7:30 p.m. and we heard this almighty bang. And that was the Ria Pizza restaurant getting missiled. And our Ukrainian contact said, "That sounds like that bomb went off somewhere near where you were." We went off to check it out, and sure enough, that was the restaurant where we had literally been sitting 28 minutes before was now just a sea of wreckage, and they were pulling dead bodies out and so on. And I remember thinking, 28 minutes, there's no way that I would have been able to order a pizza, get it delivered, eat it, and then sit and have a coffee afterwards. I would have almost certainly been in there, which is quite a strange. It plays on my mind quite a bit, that. But I mean, it's the kind of thing that every Ukrainian will have a story like that, I suspect. If it's not happened to them, it's happened to a friend. And often, there isn't a happy ending at the end of that story either. So that death and injury can just come raining out of the sky in Ukraine in a way that it tends not to quite in the same way in Baghdad and places like that. But those are probably the sort of takeaways I have of my own sort of reporting experience in Ukraine itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I had another friend who was at the restaurant just before it went off, because obviously it was very popular with journalists, right? Which is almost certainly why the Russians targeted. They've had a pattern of targeting hotels that are frequently populated by journalists. Look, there aren't many people visiting hotels in Donetsk, right? It's just
No.
it's clear who is going to be there. It's going to be NGO workers. It's going to be reporters, not ones with big details either. It's going to be like just lots of freelancers, and it's it's a really tragic thing to have happened. So look, why don't you tell us about your book? I'd love to hear more about it, what inspired it, and maybe you can tell us some of the information contained within.
Well, yeah, sure. So I've just brought out a book. It's called The Mad and the Brave: The Untold Story of Ukraine's Foreign Legion, and it is about it's the war as seen through the eyes of the foreign military volunteers who have gone to fight for President Zelensky's International Legion. Most of you listeners will probably know this, but just to recap, President Zelensky created the Legion announced the creation of the Legion on day 3 of the war, when he was still in his bunker and all seemed very, very dark for Ukraine. And he said, anybody who wants to come and fight for Ukraine, who's got previous military experience, please come and do so. And he couched it as not just a fight for Ukraine, but a fight for democracy, human rights, and freedom, for all of Europe and indeed the rest of the world. And that captured the imaginations of a lot of people around the world. I think within the first couple of weeks there, about 20,000 people applying to join. Not all of them turned up, but it was in large numbers, and it was shades also of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where the elected socialist government in Spain faced a hostile coup attempt from the forces of General Franco, the fascist forces, assisted by the Germans under Hitler. And in that case, an international brigade of around 35,000, I think it was, in the end, went and fought for the Spanish, the elected Spanish government. And that's well remembered. That's where George Orwell, for example, went and fought, writing his book Homage to Catalonia. It's where Ernest Hemingway wrote what inspired his novel From Whom the Bell Tolls. So, there was a lot of sort of historical parallels to this, and also a sense of, I think, of romance. That's how people see the Spanish Civil War as being a very noble cause to have gone and fought for. And so Zelensky's words captured the imaginations of a lot of people. And I think I was in Kiev when I first became dimly aware of British and American volunteers turning up to fight, most of them ex-soldiers. I thought it would be interesting to write a book about the war as seen from their point of view. I remember speaking to a few of them just on the phone, and I think what struck me was that you got very vivid accounts of what was going on, of a sort that I was not going to get by interviewing Ukrainian soldiers, because most of the interviews I have to do, that I don't speak Ukrainian, unfortunately, and if you're doing things through a translator, a great deal is lost in translation, both in terms of the detail and also the colour and the vividness with which stories are told. So I thought that this is perhaps a way of writing a book that will be that can engage Western audiences well. Certainly in Britain, there is a big interest in the war in Ukraine, but I think you engage certain readers who might not otherwise follow it that closely if you're doing a book about the war as seen through the eyes of fellow Britons or fellow Westerners, and they will identify with John from London or Dave from Manchester and his account of the war in a way that they might not do with accounts given by Ukrainians, simply because of the people that that they recognise. And so that's basically what the book is. It's an attempt to it's basically the first 2 years of the war, as told through accounts from about a dozen different volunteers. And as well as exploring their motives for fighting, I try and kind of pick volunteers who've been witness to different bits of the conflict. So there's some, there's accounts of the siege of Kiev, for example. There's the war down in the south. There's the trench warfare in the Donbass, and then there's also accounts of people getting who were captured by the Russians and interrogated and tortured in captivity. So hopefully people get to get two books for the price of one. They get the accounts of the battle from the volunteers and their stories and why they joined, but also a wider narrative of the war itself, how it started and why, and what the key moments were in it.
So, I mean, look, I really think what you said there is interesting about the kinds of information you get through translation. With my documentary, The Battle for Kiev, one of the most interesting stories that I had there was one of the foreign volunteers that came to fight, because he was able to articulate to people back home. It's not just the language, it's also to people who aren't Ukrainian. Ukrainians understand what's at stake. British people, Americans, the Anglophone world in which we work as English speaking journalists, we have different experiences, and the lack of understanding of what's going on in Eastern Europe is, there's been very little reason to pay much attention to what's happened in this part of the world if you're living in Yorkshire or Humberside or wherever, since the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's also just about connecting with people in ways that they and I found much of this with Syria too, that people cared a lot, hearing stories of volunteers, charity workers that are traveling into Syria, and obviously very, very horrific and sad things happened to some of those brave people that did decide to do that. So focusing back on these foreign volunteers, have you got any in particular that stand out that you wanted to talk about on the show? I mean, obviously I'm going to put a link to your book so people can read it for themselves, but it'd be great to hear a little, a couple of examples of
sure. I'll sort of try and pick a few who are fairly typical of the foreign volunteers. But one of the things that drew me to it is that as well as these people being able to describe things with a vividness that I might not get through translation, it's the fact that they have that sort of fish out of water quality to it. This is not a part of the world they know, and they are suddenly hurling themselves into a conflict of the sort that Britain has not experienced since World War II. And it is about as testing a combat environment as anybody is ever going to be in. This is not like going and fighting a war when you're with a NATO task force in Afghanistan, for example, where you have all the aces and you're fighting a small insurgency. This time you are almost like the insurgents. As one volunteer once said to me, he says, we feel when we're up against the Russians, it reminds me of Afghanistan. We feel like we're the white Taliban. Fighting very much against the odds. They've got the bigger guns, they've got the better equipment, they've got far more people, so on and so forth, and we're just having to sort of live by our wits. But one of the volunteers was a guy called Jack Knight. He's from South London, and he was I think in his late 20s when he came out here. But he had been a Royal Engineer, a sapper, somebody who does mine clearance and explosive expert and so on. And he, for various reasons, I think when he joined up, he never got to go to Afghanistan, and for that, and therefore I think he felt that his chance to see conflict, to see combat, had probably gone for the foreseeable future, because Britain was clearly not keen to get in any further military engagements after Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think he contemplated, having spent years training as a soldier and never actually getting to go to war. And in that sense, soldiering is a very unusual occupation, because it's probably the only occupation where you can train for years and years and years and a whole career and never put those skills into practice. It's like being a surgeon who never operates, or a journalist who never actually gets out on a story. There's that element of wanting to see whether you can cope. And I mean, he like most of the volunteers, these are not people who are just looking for any old scrap. They wouldn't go and get involved in a religious war or a civil war. It had to be a war that felt morally just, and this is probably the first time that there had been such a war since World War II. And Yeah, so he felt like the cause was right, but also there was as with a lot of the volunteers, there was a personal dynamic there as well. There was something, there was an element of self-interest in it too, that he wanted to see whether he could, put his skills into practice and be up to the challenges really. And this clearly is a very challenging environment. He also had a great grandfather who had won the Victoria Cross for rescuing people while under fire in World War One. And a lot of his family had been in the military, and that kind of, I think, weighed quite heavily on his mind. It's like, could I actually do what my great grandfather did? And it's a kind of common thread among a lot of the volunteers is that it's like, in the West, we live in this quite cosseted environment where we've had 80 years of peace. What would I be like if it all unraveled? Could I actually cope with the sorts of life and death challenges that my grandfathers faced in World War II? And Ukraine offers that chance to find out. Yeah. The book has occasionally been described as a sort of mixture of homage to Catalonia with Fight Club on steroids. And I think there is an element of that. A lot of the volunteers do want to sort of see if they've got what it takes. But anyway, to get back to Jack, he came out here. He duly fought on and off for the best part of 3 years. He's now back in the UK, but he did actually achieve his ambition. He was involved in some quite heavy combat in the Donbass at one point, and did actually rescue several people from a minefield. So I think he feels that he's lived up to his ancestors' reputation.
There's some really clearly very brave men and women, of course, that have come to volunteer for Ukraine. One of the issues I had when I was covering this is that some of the people coming over were also not altogether there, right? And I know that your book is called The Mad and the Brave, and so I haven't read it yet. So do you deal with any of the sort of more unsavory characters that have
Yes,
rocked up in
we
Ukraine?
do. I mean, hence the name, The Mad and the Brave, really, because I think that there's in most of the volunteers there is a bit of both. Probably you've got to be a bit crazy to go out there, but it's a case of how the ratios of madness to bravery or bravery to madness vary greatly among the volunteers. And certainly one of the problems was that because the Legion was effectively announced overnight by President Zelensky, apparently without much consultation with his generals, there wasn't really much capacity for suddenly absorbing 20,000 foreigners into the Ukrainian Armed Forces overnight, not when they were also dealing with the small business of fighting off a full-scale invasion. So when the volunteers started streaming in across the border, there were quite a few adventurers, thrill seekers, fantasists of various sorts. Many of whom had no military experience, or if they did, they vastly inflated it. And they were all SEAL, U.S. Navy SEALs, ex Delta Force operators, ex SAS, ex Royal Marines, and so on and so forth. And there was definitely a problem in the early days with those sorts of people. The Ukrainians didn't really have any means to vet them. and I think to some extent didn't really care as long as people were willing to fight. There was an element of like, if we stick you in a large army and give you a gun, as long as you're prepared to kind of do what we say, it doesn't really matter. But that did cost them here and there, where certain Ukrainian commanders, I think, got the sense that a lot of some of the volunteers, a minority, were overstating their credentials, and that gave the rest of them led to a lot of the rest of them being tarred with the same brush. So as time went on, within the first few months, a lot of the volunteers who were good soldiers and who turned up and had good intentions found themselves going around different Ukrainian units, offering their services basically, and being told, "Sorry, we don't really want you." And that's quite a hard thing to go through. I think you turn up, fight, ready to lay down your life for somebody else, having gone through all the soul searching of leaving your family, your job, and so on. And then being told, actually, do you know what, mate? I'm not that interested. So it was difficult for a lot of them, and I think it is to their credit that some of them did actually stick it out and did eventually find commanders who would take them on, but they had to prove themselves to them. It wasn't just a case of, yeah, fine, you go and man that trench. A lot of the Ukrainian commanders were quite suspicious of them, as I think I would be if I was a British army officer and I held a whole load of Ukrainians or a whole load of other people from some other part of the world, let alone a bunch who had a large smattering of fantasists and nut jobs among them. I would be a bit like, I don't know who these people are. I'm not putting them in any situation where I have to rely on them and put the lives of my own soldiers in their hands, which is what a lot of battlefields do involve.
So I mean, I met some of these guys when they came. Some of them will be in my film within that first 2-3 day period where it was just absolute chaos. And then I stayed with them for the first couple of weeks as they were starting to get training and so on and so forth. Now, it's important to note that these are combatants who've chosen to come to an active theatre of conflict. So there's legal elements to what happens to them on battlefields, and obviously, but I support the Ukrainian cause, so for me it's tragic to see even combatants die here for this cause. Now, obviously, a lot of foreign volunteers have been killed over the course of this war. You just have to go in Kyiv and go and stand by the memorial in Maidan Square, and you'll see all of the foreign flags that are flying in that square, which it shows you. And it's not just, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States. It's Colombia, Bolivia. It's parts of Africa. It's Asian country, Kazakhstan. There are volunteers from all around the world coming here because they believe in the Ukrainian cause. Can you tell me about some of those that have tragically lost their lives in the pursuit of joining the Foreign Legion? Those stories that you may have come across during your coverage.
Well, yes, I mean, as you said, a lot have died. My sort of the Ukrainian Armed Forces don't give any stats on how many foreign volunteers have died, but my sense from looking at informal Facebook pages that keep informal tallies that are based on news reports and so on suggests that maybe about 500 to 700 at least have died. And I haven't checked for a few months. I would imagine that tally has probably risen, which means a much higher rate of mortality than the war on terror and the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. But yeah, I'll give you an example. One of the volunteers that I first met in November 2022 down in Mykolaiv when I was just starting to research the book, a chap called Christopher Perryman, nicknamed Pez. He had just arrived. I interviewed him in a cafe, and he was an ex-Fusilier infantryman from the northeast of England. He'd fought in Iraq. He was quite an experienced soldier, really, relatively speaking. He was a good case of somebody who was basically bored with civilian life. And
As you
at the
do.
time of yeah, at the time of the he'd left the army a few years before at the time of the war, and he was actually working as a security guard on HS2, which is a big for non-UK listeners. It was a big railway line project that was going on in Britain at the time, and there were various eco-protesters trying to stop the railway line being built through an area of woodland, and he was one of the security guards paid to stop them sabotaging the works. And he said he hated this job because he had to sit around in a high vis vest and helmet and just getting called fascist and kind of all sorts of names by these protesters all the time. This is a guy who's fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who knows a villain when he sees one, and he's like, right, you're calling me a fascist. What are you talking about? What do you know of these things? And anyway, when the war came along, I think news spread through all the ex-soldiers networks pretty quickly, and lots of them started talking about, you thinking of going? Yeah, I am. No, I'm not, or whatever. And he volunteered. Like a lot of them, he was one of the ones who turned up and then found that down in Mykolaiv, it was hard to get any actual soldiering work because the Legionnaires' reputation had kind of preceded them by that time. And I think he eventually went home actually because he had about 2 or 3 months where he was offering his services as a trained sniper, and just getting nowhere. But he returned and then spent a couple of probably about a year, I think it was, serving with various different Ukrainian military units. And then in October of 2023, I think it was, I remember hearing, I hadn't been in touch with him for a while, but I remember hearing that he had been killed by an artillery shell. And, it's obviously a very, very tragic case, obviously very typical of what happens for people who serve out here. One thing I do remember him telling me at the time when I first interviewed him was that he had a son, a 10-year-old son. He wasn't with the partner anymore, but with the mother of the son, but he still saw him very regularly. And I said to him, like, do you think it's wise to be going out to Ukraine if you've got a young son? And he said, well, yeah, lots of people say that to me. They say, look, if you're really that concerned about the future and standing up for the young and vulnerable, don't be doing that in Ukraine. Do that back, think of your own immediate offspring first. But he said, well, my answer to that is that I, that's a civilian way of looking at things. I'm from a military family. These risks are the way me and my uncles and grandfathers and so on have always looked at this sort of stuff. And if everybody said that, then that they had to look after their kids and they couldn't join up, then we in Britain would probably all be speaking German, and also Ukrainians wouldn't be signing up in droves. There were lots of Ukrainian fathers having to do the same thing, and I am also well trained. I can teach these people a lot, and so that was his attitude. And he said, look, that's what I do. This is my job. I'm a trained protector, and my son will, when he's old enough to understand, will either condemn me for my decision or he will understand it and support me. And yeah, that was the way that one was left. He was quite philosophical about it, I think, and there will be listeners who will take different views about the rights or wrongs of his decision. And but I think that's why it makes an interesting subject for a book, because there are no rights and wrongs, and people will obviously have their own views about that. But it's a common thread among a lot of the volunteers that they go out to Ukraine not with the sort of wholesale blessing, obviously, often of their families, the next of kin. It's very different from when you see British soldiers maybe getting waved off to Iraq or Afghanistan or the Falklands, where there's big ticker tape crowds, seeing them off, and big welcoming parties when they get back. A lot of the volunteers, when they said, "I'm thinking of going to Ukraine," if they've got one thing in common, it is that they had a lot of friends and family, sometimes partners, but sometimes just parents or brothers, sisters, pals saying, "You are crazy. What the hell is the matter with you? Have you got some sort of death wish? Is this some wider cry for help? Are you feeling suicidal about something?" There were very few who got people saying, "Yeah, good for you, mate. Good to be going out and doing your bit for democracy." And that in some ways makes the decision all the harder, that you want to go out and fight, and everybody else is kind of quietly muttering behind your back, saying like, "You must be crazy," and yet a lot of them still come. Yeah.
Well, also, look, they say that about war journalists all the time too, as well as why don't you sign up for the front line, as if as if like the Ukrainian military is dying to have a 38-year-old asthmatic with no military experience.
Well, yeah, I mean,
whereas my job as a reporter, the platform I have allows me to do much more than I would running around with an AK-47
it's true. I mean, as a reporter, you do if you cover conflicts, even just occasionally, you will get people occasionally in your social circle sort of saying, especially if you've got kids, as I have, like, is it sensible for someone to be doing that? Isn't it a bit selfish, especially if they get themselves into trouble? Because you could end up not just getting killed, you could come home injured or traumatized, and others have to look after you and so on. And yet, as reporters, we're not running anything like the risks that these soldiers are doing, where their sole task often is to go and get involved in trouble and be in at the very, very sharp end of it. And certainly from the stories I've recounted in the book, and the accounts I've got from the volunteers, the sort of stuff they're seeing and doing, the kind of spots on the front lines where they are, is completely unlike anything that I would ever get near as a reporter. Certainly not on maybe once in a lifetime. But yeah, they are getting in scrapes often, on a daily basis, and how they manage it, I really have no idea.
So, I mean, look, again, I have this thing where I don't really talk about work with my civilian friends. It's just if they aren't already about that life, I don't tend to talk about it at all, not because I don't want to share my experiences with my friends, but because we are from such different worlds that hearing their judgments on the kinds of things that you do, it just becomes sort of, it's not worth it's not worth even trying to have those conversations. I've learned over many years that it's like I might as well be speaking a different language to them, because they don't understand. So it must be like so much more extreme when you are going off to fight. So I can only just imagine what it's like to have those conversations for those people. We do have a quick question from RGB. I've tried to answer it myself. They say, what are the nationalities most represented right now among the foreign fighters? I've said I've seen a lot of Colombians that have been turning up in Kyiv recently. And that pivots into my final question, is you have leaned into talking about them as volunteers, whereas they are paid in most instances. But again, the way Russia wants to portray some of these men, or all of these men, rather, is that they are soldiers of fortune, mercenaries. And it's fair to say some people from some parts of the world who are professional soldiers have come to make a living because it's what they're good at and it's what they're trained to do. And there's money to be made doing it. So they do exist. But I get the impression from the way you've been talking, particularly about these men that have been there fighting for quite a while, that they aren't those men who have come to talk about, who've come to earn a living, as it were. So
that's right. Well, to quickly answer your reader's question, I think it's something like between 52 and 60 nations in total have contributed. Have got people here. The majority, I would say, are the Americans are the biggest group, biggest single group that is. Then Europeans. You probably got people from practically every European country. A lot from the Eastern European countries, especially the Baltics, and quite a lot from Georgia as well. Again, a country that has had its own direct experience of military bullying.
Chechens too, Russians. Yeah. There are lots of those.
Chechens, even Russians. So yes, I mean, obviously a heavy representation of people from the ex-Soviet satellite countries, and then yes, you also have you then have a smattering of people from places like India and South Korea and so on, Australia and New Zealand, of course, and Britain, and then yes, the other sort of notable contingent is from Latin America, particularly Colombia, where I understand that because of Colombia's recent history of conflict with drug lords and paramilitaries, they've got large numbers of Western-trained, US-trained troops, people trained to quite a high caliber with some combat experience. But for them, yes, the salary that you get for combat pay in Ukraine, which is about $3,000 a month, is better than they'll earn in Colombia.
Well, also the Colombian situation has, there was a lot of conflict in Colombia over the last few decades. It started to. I'm not an expert in Colombia, but we have a sort of agreements with FARC and so on that have meant that a lot of these men that were trained for conflict are now finding themselves at a loss of needing something to
do. Another important point to make is though that the basic pay, standard pay for the International Legion is only about $600 a month. So
small amount.
I mean, even if you're on the so if you're a British fighter, for example, the $600 a month will kind of pay for a bit of living expenses and so on. It means you're not accruing debt to be here, but it's very, very far short of minimum wage in the UK. So I think it's certainly say that the majority of the Western fighters and most of the European fighters here are not here for the money. If you want to earn money for carrying a gun, you can go and work as a private security contractor in Middle, and then you'll earn $1,000 a day. As for the Colombians and the other Latino fighters that are here, I think the money is said to be a bit more of a motive. I should say I haven't spoken to any of these people. I dare say a lot of them would say, well, actually, the money's not bad, but the cause is good too, and I miss the military life, and it's an interesting, it's interesting to see this side of the world. It's noticeable that they're all fighting on Ukraine's side. Most of these people are not fighting on the Russian side. I think that there may be a financial element to it, but it's not just purely a mercenary thing of I will fight for the highest bidder and I don't care who I'm fighting for.
Well, listen, thanks so much, Colin, for joining us on the show and giving us those experiences. If people want to find more of your work, I see you have a WordPress. I'll put that in. Where can people find your work? If you could give us a final, pitch for your book.
Okay, well, I tweet on @ColinFreeman99, and then I do have a WordPress blog, which should admit has not been updated for some time. I've been too busy getting the book finished. The book is available on things like Amazon and from the HarperCollins website. If anyone, and you can download it on Kindle and so on. If anybody has trouble getting hold of it, tell them to drop me a line, get in touch with me via Twitter, send me a direct message or something like that, or email my website. I do check those quite regularly, and I check the spam as well.
Never check the spam, Colin. Never check the spam.
Anybody who wants to get hold of a copy will be welcome. If there's anybody doing a book club who wants to do it for their book club, I don't know if you will, but I will be very happy to come and be your sort of your guest, either in person or online. For even if there's only sort of 2 or 3 of you or something like that, I do enjoy talking about the book to people who've read it. So
that's exciting. You get Colin for your book club. He's willing to listen to those options.
Yep, and that's about it really. And yeah, have a browse of it on the Amazon website or somewhere, and hopefully you might decide to read it. Yeah.
Well, look, I will let you know, as I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, you weren't talking to 3 or 4 people tonight. You've been talking to just over 2,000 people tonight. So
Hello,
they've
everyone.
tuned in to hear about your book. So I'll definitely put that in the show notes, and the audience are thanking you as well for coming on. And yeah, look, hit me up the next time you're in Kyiv. Let's go let's go to the Buena Vista as we all did. All right, all the best. Ta-ra.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for listening. Good night.
Bye-bye. That was Colin Freeman telling us about his book, The Mad and the Brave, the story of Ukraine's International Legion, Ukraine's Foreign Legion. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So if you're watching along on YouTube, it's down there already. If you are watching along on YouTube, please do like and subscribe, or leave a comment if you've got any ideas or thoughts for other guests or whatever. I do read all of my YouTube comments because largely they're pleasant. Whereas if you tweet me, I won't read it. Almost certainly won't read all of my tweets, but I will read all of my YouTube comments. So if you're trying to get my attention, YouTube's the way to do it. If you're following on Twitter tonight, hello, thank you guys for watching the show. The only way to interact with the show live is through Twitch. So if you have been watching along, on our 3 times a week shows, please do consider creating a Twitch account and hitting that follow button, because we've only got a few hundred followers at the moment, and it would really help to grow. Even if you don't ever use Twitch, do it to help the channel grow. The more we grow, the more people will see it, and hopefully the better shows we can do. So thank you to everyone who has been watching along for another week of shows. Got another week of shows for you next week. I hope you're enjoying them all. Yes, join us on Twitch. As you can see, the audience are encouraging you to come along. So please do consider it. And if not, if you're watching along on YouTube afterwards, you guys are equally as important, even if you can't, be there live for the shows. But I do appreciate that. I do appreciate you sharing the shows, telling your friends about it. I hope you are enjoying the interesting conversations that we are trying to have. I hope you can enjoy watching things grow on the back and change as we try and evolve the show. I hope you can see that the technical elements are getting better. We were late to start today because Streamlabs, the program I use to make all of this happen, wasn't working for some reason. The invite link wasn't working, so I used Zoom, and it seemed to work. So yeah, thank you for all the support, guys. I appreciate it. I will explain. If you see me looking around, I have a multi-screen setup. So the chat happens on this screen, and I've got Twitch open on this screen. So it's all. If I'm not looking at the camera, it doesn't mean I'm not looking at the guest or not. And also sometimes I will be looking downwards, and that's generally me writing in my notebook, particular points, so I don't forget, so I can ask the guest. So if I'm looking like I'm not looking directly at the guest, it's because I'm doing these things, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm disinterested. I look at myself on the camera and think it looks like I'm not looking at the screen, but I am. I'm just looking all around. It's just where the camera is, so it gives you the impression that I'm looking away from the subject when I'm quite clearly not. Anyway, so that's my explanation for where my eyes go during the show. I will admit that sometimes I will check my phone, but only when it beeps or something. So if you've got my WhatsApp, you can WhatsApp me during the show, and you'll see the moment that I look away. So there we go. Checking headlines. I try not to check the headlines, a random shot in the dark, because I will occasionally, when there's big breaking news, I will, because I've got Twitter open, I'll jump onto it. But I don't want to get too distracted. And look, this format really doesn't really work well with breaking news, because I'm booking the guests in advance and we're talking about a specific topic, and breaking news, unless it's like the guest for the topic, it's hard to do. And I don't want to crowbar stuff into conversations. because they're less interesting when it's done like that. These are more natural, really, aren't they? They're just kind of, bringing people on who are like experts or good people on a specific field and having them talk about that field. So I'm hoping that this is all kind of filtering in, and I'm building an audience of people who are quite interested in foreign policy stuff and politics and all that good jazz. But yeah, thank you all, everyone. Please do like, subscribe, follow, and I'll catch you next week for another set of shows. Thank you, everyone. Good night.